Are we good? All right. Oh, that's much better. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. This is our first official discussion and event for our new book, The Price She Pays. So we really appreciate you all being here. My name is Erin Strout. I am a co-author on the book, and I'm a journalist who covers women's sports, health, and fitness. And it's my pleasure to introduce the panel today. But first, I want to give a big thank you to New York Roadrunners for having us here and for organizing this event and putting it on for us. Thank you, New York Roadrunners. So tonight, obviously, we're going to be discussing the impact of running and sports on female mental health. And I'm going to first, I had to write down all the accolades of these women up here because I knew I was going to forget something if I didn't. So first, let's welcome our panel moderator, Christine Yu, who is the author of Up to Speed, the groundbreaking science of women athletes, licensed marriage and family therapist from Bend, Oregon, a former runner for the University of Oregon, founder of the Athletes Mental Health Foundation, co-founder of Thrive Mental Health, and like I just said, now a published author. And Dr. Tiffany Brown is a senior faculty member at the University of Oregon Couples and Family Therapy Graduate Program, licensed marriage and family therapist who works with athletes and provides mental health education for coaches and staff.
Also, thank you so much to New York Roadrunners for hosting us, to Book Club Bar for being here and selling books. So if you haven't purchased a copy of The Price She Pays, be sure to pick one up before you leave. Authors will be here to sign it for you as well. And I am so thrilled to be here because this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. And, you know, especially there's so much excitement and momentum around women's sports these days. So many incredible athletic feats that are happening. And at the same time, we're talking about mental health a lot more within sports. And your book, I mean, it couldn't come at a better time. So I'm curious, for you both, why this book? Why write it now? And what really inspired you to do it?
Well, I think what's fun about that question is the book came out of a conversation that Katie and I were having very awkwardly, actually, and I'll let her tell you her part of it. But what came to our knowledge and understanding was how much the stories of women and girls in sport was not singular. And so we just kept hearing them over and over and over again. And it came to a point where it felt like the only thing to do was to write a book about it. And as weird as that sounds, I don't think those words would have come out of my mouth before this project. But it felt like what Katie had dealt with in her own journey as an athlete, we knew was not unique, and we knew how common it was. And that to us was the story that needed to be told.
Yeah, it was definitely meant to be a partnership with everybody. And I had my own experience with college athletics that I didn't even know until after the fact. And as Tiffany and I were unpacking it, realized it isn't a unique story. And that's kind of the gutting part of it, right? And then we were so fortunate to get connected with Susan, who saw the potential of the need to kind of pull the veil back on a female athlete's mental health and then be able to also provide solutions. Sport is an amazing thing, and while I had an unfortunate experience and so many people included in the book had an unfortunate experience, there's so many ways that we can prevent that. And so there is still so much hope, and that's where we wanted to do something of, this can't be the next generation story too. There has to be an end to it, and fortunately we all shared that passion to be able to consolidate it into a bound book.
No, it definitely is an incredible resource, and you guys hit on so many different topics in this book. And I'm curious from your perspective, what are the biggest challenges or pressures for those who identify as girls or women in their experience of sport, right? What do you think it is about, being a girl or woman in sport that makes these mental health issues and concerns so salient?
Can y'all hear me? Oh, there we go. We needed to make some systemic changes. And so both of us being systemic mental health clinicians, we started zooming out and looking at the system of how can we create systems and support networks and teams that are really built for girls, that understand girls and look at the complexity of female athletes' needs. And that's where we saw some of the breakdown is we need to celebrate them, right? You look at girls' matches and games, and how can we start going to their events to support them, to make them feel valued in the way of that they really deserve to be valued and celebrated. And so, we're seeing more hype and more people watching women's sports and things of that nature, and we hope that that momentum can continue from a healthy framework to make sure that they come out of sport, the other side, more healthy and empowered than when they entered the sports system.
Yeah, I'm curious, where do you see, the current sports system, breaking down, if you will, right? And if there are any examples from athletes that you've spoken to that kind of highlight this point or kind of, make it come alive.
I think in a lot of ways, the system expects women to perform as if they are in men's sports. And so part of the breakdown is this continuous issue of women being compared to whoever is competing in men's sports. And so, that those are the scores, those are the type of training, that's the type of gear, everything is compared to that. And that breakdown creates such a alignment of need. And the other a lot of the stories that we wrote about had some story attached to it in terms of their experience where what they needed was someone to pause and listen to them. I think about one of the stories of Rhonda in the book who had, a lot of significant challenges as outside of sport, significant family challenges, a lot of trauma. What she needed was to be able to go to sport and have it be the place that could, let her shine, because that's, what she needed to kind of navigate the family trauma that was separate. What ended up happening is she sought out support from her coaches, and they decided that she needed to go get treatment because she was kind of too much for them. Her mental health issues were too much, and, it probably served her to go get treatment at the time that she did. But they promised her that she would have a spot when she came back. And which is partly what allowed her to be as successful in treatment as she was. And when she came back, they wouldn't let her back on the team. She did everything that they said to do along the way. And those are the kinds of breakdowns that we see where, it's next person up and we're going to, toss these athletes to the side rather than being invested like they said they would be invested. And it's costing, unfortunately, more and more pain and suffering when it doesn't need to.
Yeah, and I definitely want a mental health foundation that comes up and tries to fill the gap. You have these advocacy groups that spring up, unfortunately, right, in the wake of some tragedies. But ultimately, there doesn't seem to be any system of accountability either, right? So how do we fix that? What do we do about that, and whose responsibility ultimately should that be?
Yeah, 100%. You use the language that I use all the time, that there aren't systems of accountability. Unlike any other career field, everybody has a licensing board. There's something that's going to give some type of boundaries. And in athletics, there aren't systems of accountability, and that's what we need. And the beauty is we all can have a partner of considering athlete well-being, but it's not quantified. There's no way that anybody is accountable to that other than just, I considered the athlete's well-being instead of things like injury rates and retention rates and even donors. What are your athletes donating to your program once they step away? And so if we can create healthy youth systems, if we can have some parameters at higher levels, if we can all support women's sports, right? If we can check in with athletes and kind of help train them to learn, how can I change gears versus think I just need to live my life pedal to the metal all the time, right? I need to learn how to change gears so that I can also be honoring what I'm needing so that I can be an advocate in that way. One of my very favorite stories was when we started interviewing little girls and learning from them, 7-year-olds across the country who were able to say, the playground rules are the girls get the swing sets and the play structure, and the boys get the fields and the sport courts. Like, those things need to change, right? So that girls can see their value, that they can be fully integrated into the sports system from itty-bitty ages. And that's something all of us can do. We can check in with our kids at the end of the day about, what do you play?
What happens is it gets named in a contract as, we're gonna look at this, we're gonna pay attention to this. And then all it is a checkbox. And the accountability needs to come down to, not only is it the responsibility of the coaches, but it's the responsibility of the league administrators who are overseeing the coaches. It's the responsibility of, if I'm thinking what I'm doing. And so I think there's a lot of passing of the buck, and it's so much easier for people to put it on the after.
Mental health practitioners, right, being able to give very concrete, advice and things for people to do and questions for people to think about. So I wanted to, kind of shift gears a little bit and think about, I'm a parent of kids who play sports, and I think a lot about the sporting culture in which they're growing up in. And, as someone had described to me once as this youth industrial sports complex, right? And thinking about the values that are instilled in that. So when it comes to parenting kids who are athletes, as a parent, what should we be looking for in coaches, right? What's a good, healthy environment to think about, our kids being in?
I love that question, and I have 3 kids too who I love sport, right? And that was part of this motivator of sport is an amazing thing, so much so that I hope if my kids love it that they also engage in the system, right? And then it's complex of, how do we ensure that it's safe? How do we make sure that they're gonna be better humans because of their experience in sport? And I think part of my hope is that right now, and I hand it to coaches because they're tasked with so many things, right? You look at even a youth coach's plate, and it's overflowing with 8 million different things, some of in their wheelhouse and others that aren't. So creating a framework so people aren't having to guess. And I think as parents, that would really help us so that we'd know, they are adhering to a philosophy or a safe sport kind of certification type thing. We know things, there are protections in place. A lot of it is as a parent, and one of the things I do is, Camden's right here, so he'll hear me say this, even watching their behavior when they come home, right? You can really see a difference in terms of what sport they're engaging in. How do they come home, and how are they acting, and how are they engaging with the rest of the family system? That is oftentimes, as a parent, one of the first big indicators that you can tell is, what is it bringing out in them? And using that as some of your first reflection point of, what is this sport system instilling in them? And then, of course, I don't know about you all, but watching the sidelines has become one of my favorite pastimes now, between watching coaches, watching fellow parents, watching what's happening with the athletes on the sideline. So you can get a lot of just observing, is the coach able to regulate their nervous system? Not that they aren't having a reaction, but are they able to regulate in some form or fashion? If not, probably somewhat of a red flag, right? Because what are your little humans learning? That same behavior. So you can observe what's happening at the sports field. We had numerous parents in the book say they had their kid try out for multiple travel teams, and they'd observe, how did my kid come home after each tryout? What do I observe from the parents? Are the parents on the sidelines taking notes and frantically evaluating what's happening, or are the parents not even at the tryout and they just come back up and pick their kid up? How does their kids seem when they get into the car after the tryout? I think that's often, from my perspective as a parent, that's the best feedback I feel like I've seen in kids, is just kind of watching their own behavior. And knowing, try a couple different leagues and see what you notice. What are some of the differences that you see in your kids?
You will see me pacing very nervously on the sidelines when my children are playing, and especially when my son is pitching. I have to leave the field because I cannot watch. But, you had mentioned, right, so some of these potential red flags, right, that might come up, whether, something you might see in your kid and their reaction, something you might see in the coach. When you do suspect or you kind of have that spidey sense, right? Like something might, I don't know, I don't necessarily feel comfortable with a certain situation with a coach. Like, what can parents do, right? Like, what are there resources that they can look to, other advice or conversations that they should think about having?
Well, we have some videos on our website. Nicely timed question there,
I didn't
Christine.
tee that up purposely already.
Yeah, that looks specifically at this question that says, if you're dealing with this particular issue with a coach, here's some suggestions on how to handle it. And part of it is because I think so many parents, and rightfully so, want what's best for their kids. And so if they're dealing with a coach who is kind of testing their own limits as a parent, it's pretty common for parents to kind of go at a coach pretty hard. And then, I think about the process of communication here. They go at the coach pretty hard. The coach has a reaction back, and the parent is like, how dare you talk to me that way? And so part of it is learning how to be in a conversation with a coach that says, hey, can we talk about what's going on with my kid? Or asking really curiously, maybe their perspective on something. And what we found is the more that those conversations can be slowed down and not in a reactive place, then they tend to go pretty well. Parents also are navigating, is this something that I should take to a coach, or is this just my own, wish the coach didn't coach that way, or when I was a kid, I got, coaching this other way. So parents have work to do to decide what about what's happening is worthy of that conversation, and what is kind of navigating their own internal either frustration or reaction to what's happening. And then there's another thing that I think we don't talk enough about around kids and coaches and parents is sometimes kids need to not go back to a coach. Or back to a league, or back to a team. And those are big decisions for families to make, and big decisions for parents to set boundaries with. We had one story in the book of a parent who, made that really tough decision for their daughter, knowing that the coach was not only harsh, but incredibly racist. And so it was a tough decision around, not to say that this parent was like, should I take my kid away from a racist coach? But it was also weighing out the success of the coach, what that coach could do for their child, the future of their child in the sport. What does it mean to step out now versus later? And those decisions are big. And, so I think even if folks aren't parenting, being able to recognize the challenge of those decisions for parents, knowing that sometimes we're going to get it right and then sometimes we're not, but we can always go back and have the conversation. And I think coaches need parents to kind of slow it down a little bit, put the brakes on a little bit, and be in conversation versus being in reaction.
Yeah, and then, I've also heard some feedback from coaches in terms of almost being afraid, right, that they're going to cross some line in terms of, there's so much more awareness, about mental health issues and, not wanting to do something that might be, say, like a safe sport violation or, anything like that, right? So what advice do you have for coaches, or how can they then best support their athletes, right, in a way that, they don't feel like they're kind of caught in this between a rock and a hard place, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, we had coaches, sorry, y'all. We had coaches throughout the interviewing process tell us that it was a liability, right? Because the potential cost of mental health conditions can be acute and scary. And they said, we're scared. We don't know what to do with this. This feels like a liability. And it is a lot. And I think the thing that we oftentimes came back to is, you do not have to be a mental health provider. This is not yours to solve. This is not yours to treat. That is going to be the job of other people. It is your job to meet them with compassion and curiosity. And so that is the hope with coaches, is that they can hear things and not feel like they have to solve it, but rather be able to hear it and know what to do to support the athlete. But they don't have to take care of it. They are not the provider. They are not the one who has to solve it. But curiosity, we can all have curiosity, we can all have compassion, and that's what we found over and over again in these stories, is that really was the missing piece of just talking to the athlete and being curious and learning from them, and then trusting the athlete that they know what they need.
Yeah, I mean, building up. Hello. Building on that a bit, right? So then, how do you go about thinking about what constitutes a healthy coach-athlete relationship, right? Because if it is a relationship, right? It's a contract, and not an official contract, but kind of, right? We each have our roles and responsibilities. So when you think about that relationship, what goes into that? What are kind of some key tenets, if you will?
One of the things that I think matter most is the recognition that it is a relationship. And on some level, there has to be a back and forth about that relationship. There are lots of ways that relationships look, though. Not everyone is going to be like best friends and text each other all day long. But a coach that is able to hear concerns, is able to notice within their athletes when something's going on, is able to turn towards it and be willing to hear, whether it be tough feedback or even spending time around positive feedback, and being able to notice and talk overtly about what's going well. And so often we hear these stories of coaches who are so intense, and I'm gonna go a little like the other way with your question, Christine, is almost like they're so negative and they're so intense, but then it always gets, not always, but oftentimes gets kind of accepted because it's like, oh, that's just their coaching style. They get results. But what happens is we don't hear enough about what are the experience of those athletes that are dealing with that. And that's what the book really covered. Was we talked to a lot of people who did not want to be named because their coaches are in that category, and they were scared of the outcomes, or they were in season right now, or in competition, and they didn't want their coach to know that this was their experience because of their stuckness. And so for coaches, we talk a lot about how important it is to recognize how tough their job is, while recognizing that it's okay for us to have expectations, and that social contract about respect, not causing harm, willingness to be wrong, willingness to accept feedback, as some core tenets that I think all of us would go, oh yeah, that sounds pretty good. We've talked to a lot of athletes that would not say that. So much so that in some of our conversations with athletes, when we would say, just kind of off the cuff at the end of a conversation or an interview, hey, what do you think would have made the difference? And they would say, if a coach would just care about me, or if they would just care generally, or have some respect. And those were moments for Katie and I think, where we thought, we were expecting this grand plan of we need this to happen for there to be a revolution in sport. And instead it was these, teeny tiny tidbits that hopefully we are all enacting in some way in our day-to-day life that you think you could expect from a coach that you've dedicated your time and energy to.
As athletes, coaches, and parents, right? What can we do to keep this conversation going forward, right? To continue to change the environment around sports, to kind of move these pieces forward, so that we can get to, hopefully at some point, right, some systemic change and some accountability. But I'm curious, what can we be doing? How can we keep talking about this?
We have to keep talking, right? We have to keep naming it. We have to keep asking for systems. We have to keep some pressure on the points that have the ability to generate change, right? If we think about the NCAA at best practices, it's like, we can change that. That is something that we can change for. And you think about how many athletes will benefit when we're hearing. And I think one of the things that was such a privilege was talking to so many athletes. This wasn't just this generation. I thought about myself. I'm like, I haven't been in college in 20 years. Like, it's for sure had to improve in the last 20 years, and it's gotten worse, right? And so we have to have conversations, and we can't put the onus on the athlete to be the one who's going to generate that change, because what Tiffany's talking about is that power imbalance is huge, right? Because you want to be there and you want to play, and your coach holds the power. Your coach is going to give you the scholarship or conduct your play time. Like they are the ones that get to make that call. And so we need those in positions of power and those in leadership positions to really be advocating to get systems in place so that, even if it's coaches, like as a coach saying, I want to integrate mental health. I don't know, how can somebody help me? Great. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. But we can't be asking the athletes every time to just be an advocate for yourself. Go out there and be an advocate, because they just want to play so badly and will tolerate so much mistreatment at the expense of themselves, but the potential benefit to getting to be an athlete, that part, like that core part of them. So conversations, so thank you for facilitating this conversation. The more we can talk about it, the more we can name it, and the more we can provide solution, like tangible tools, so it isn't just this abstract, like, well, yeah, mental health, but no, here's really what we can do and what that means, I think would make a significant difference.
So one of the interesting things about mandating things from NCAA is I work at a university and work with quite a few student athletes over time. And I'll be in mentorship roles with them. I'll meet them, for coffee, for lunch, hear about how things are going, to care, these things that we know we all care about. And I can't walk up to a counter and buy them lunch or even buy their coffee, because it would be against NCAA rules. So when we have these conversations about what can be mandated and what cannot, as someone who works with student athletes, I have a very long list of what I'm able to do and not able to do, and how it can cost the university and it can cost the students and it can, all these things. And I get it. I mean, those are the rules. We have to play by those rules. Sometimes it's frustrating. I want to buy a cup of coffee. It's not that big of a deal. But when we talk about the meaning attached to mandating things like having mental health people available to their athletes and having the right ratio of that, or the expectations of, there should be a rule that you can't kick someone off a team because they have to go get mental health support. These things that we all could probably get on board with, but what we hear is it's not allowed to be mandated, or it's too much to be mandated. It would be way too much work. And every time that conversation comes up, I think about how I want to buy a cup of coffee for somebody, and that's not okay, because what if someone sees them and if they're wearing their athlete gear and it's clear that they're an athlete and they walk up to the counter and I buy something to the point where they have to wait and not go to the counter until after I've left it. There's such a fear. That might also say something about the institution I work for, but those are things that we know are possible because the systems already exist to mandate and to track and to educate, but yet we're unwilling to do that in terms of mental health.
Yeah, and I mean, mental health, like we've been talking about, obviously has been so much more in just the general conversation, right? Like, I feel like we're getting more comfortable speaking about it, but it does still feel, in a lot of ways, like this nebulous thing out there, right? And then we talk a lot about the systemic problems and how hard it is to do that. And I'm curious, for those sitting in the room, what are some resources available, right? Like, what are some tangible tools or resources or things that folks can look at to start to chip away at this, right? To try to figure out what is my role in this? What can I do in order to kind of start to have better conversations, for one, but also to start moving this forward?
Yeah. I mean, I would validate that all day long, right? It is kind of abstract and we don't know. And the hope is that we can get to a place that the resources are as tangible for mental health as it is if somebody sprains their ankle or tears their ACL, right? The athletic system knows exactly how to respond to physical ailments, and we need to know how to do the same for mental health. And so I think things like making space for, it doesn't mean you get cut from a team. It just means you need to take a season or you need to take a week. So some resources, we put a lot up in Athletes Mental Health Foundation. We have free trainings. We have a podcast, so ongoing dialogue in terms of our platforms. The hidden opponent for college athletes, there's a lot of advocacy for kind of athlete to athlete, this mentorship program. What would you add?
I mean, I think in many ways the resources that are out there really just listening to athletes. Believe them when they say that they're having a hard time. And so when Simone Biles had to pull out a competition, there was, a lot of mixed reviews about that. Kind of like, shouldn't you have known better? Couldn't you have gotten ready faster? You knew this was coming. So part of it is, I think, from a resource place, is learning about how mental health stuff isn't always completely tangible in the same way that physical ailments are. So, if I hurt my knee, it is really clear what I need to do. On days where maybe anxiety or depression is making its way, it doesn't always feel the same every time that anxiety is coming. So for people who are maybe even just looking for themselves or supporting others in their life, part of it is just believing people when they say that they're stressed or they're having a hard time. Go read about the things that the people in your life are saying that they're dealing with, whether it be depression or anxiety. And those resources, I think, are abundant online, but I think we kind of categorize them as like, well, I don't really have that, so I don't really need to deal with that, when it's so common for us to be navigating so many different symptoms and challenges. And I think the acceptance that it is kind of nebulous, it doesn't always fit in a perfect box, is part of the formula.
And I'm curious, what gives you hope, right? Like, what are you hopeful about?
I know, and we had this conversation throughout, and truly wouldn't have done the project if we didn't ooze hope, right? That there's so much goodness in sport, and we need to make some adjustments, but sport is hopeful, right? The character built, and the connection to self-developed, and the connection with your teammates and the people that you get to have that shared experience with. There's no more beautiful thing than sport. And I'm sure for those of you that are parents, to watch your kid go through that and the life skills that they're learning as sport kind of being the vessel is out of this world. There's so much goodness. We just need to ensure that there's attunement happening, right? That the athlete and the system agree that it is working for both parties. But sport is worth fighting for. We wouldn't have done this if there wasn't hope. And I'll say every single person we interviewed did it because they love sport. Even those who experienced the deepest, darkest trauma all did this because of their deep love of sport, because it is worth fighting for, and it's worth generating change, and change is so possible. I think that's the thing I love about this topic, is we really can prevent this. So many of these stories that we heard, we could prevent. It could be different with better systems in place. And so there's a lot of hope. I think we kind of ooze hope in that sense.
Katie does ooze hope. I love it so much. And it's a nice balance, because I think I don't always ooze it. And I say that just to be truthful. The thing that gives me the most hope is watching youth sports. I went to a basketball game of a friend of mine, and her daughter was playing, and she, I wanted to go support her, and we had been in this writing process and interview process and all the things that come with writing a book, which should be its own book, like what it's like writing a book. That would be a very meta experience. But I wanted to go, and I wanted to support her daughter and just see her kind of in action. And I think my heart needed a little kind of youth sports love. And I showed up, and they were the yellow team. They decided to name themselves the Evil Bananas. And this group of girls had a mascot that they carried around. They got to take it home from practice and bring it back, and they shared it, which I also thought was just absolutely lovely. And the thing that gave me like the oomph that I needed in that moment, and I continue to go back to when I'm thinking or see stories that make me just frustrated, is I watch these coaches and parents, but mostly the coaches, cheering on these girls with so much enthusiasm. They were teaching them, which if you've been around sports, sometimes there's like the coach style that just yells and tells you that you're doing everything wrong, but doesn't teach. And both of these coaches were on the sidelines, like pulling them over, showing them, giving them exact kind of like, shoot like this, or you need to dribble this way, or telling them something about a rule or a play. And I just sat there in awe of going, okay, the kids are gonna be okay. The more that we can do things like this, where we're having conversations to set up a future that's different for them, is, I think, the biggest piece of hope. And my strongest belief in the world is that change is always possible and that change is always happening. Even in our moments where, even between us, where I'm feeling down and out and Katie's like the hopeful one that comes along and can see, you know, the goodness in things. And that's what it takes, because it can't just be, it's not just one youth basketball game of the evil bananas who have got it all together as a team, which they did. It was fantastic, a group of 9-year-olds. But it's also knowing that people like you are going to come in and sit in a room and hear people talk about it. It's Christine agreeing to come and do this. It's knowing that everyone has a role to play and that we can do that. So we might not be able to change the NCAA. I mean, I would do it if I could already. But we can do things like this to be in conversation, so that the littlest thing you can do then taps into the next littlest thing that somebody else can do, and that's the difference that makes a difference.
Yeah, and I think that piece about youth sports and really setting up that conversation right from the beginning, setting that foundation, makes such a big difference in terms of thinking about, like, how do we make this better for the next generation so that they don't have to go through all of this. I wanted to make sure we leave time for questions, but I just have one last question for each of you. You know, just thinking about, like, what do you want people to leave this room remembering, right? Like, what's one piece of advice or a tidbit or what have you that you want people to remember from this conversation?
Yeah, I think that for me, the most special part of this process has been the collective, of that even in the depths of writing, when you feel kind of alone, or that you're doing it and you're trudging, or in my own college experience when I felt so alone, of remembering that, like, we're really all in it together. And the most special part of bringing the Price She Pays out has been all of the wonderful people that we've gotten to meet and connect with along the way, that really conveys we're really all in it together and we need each other. It's going to take every single one of us to generate the change. So if we keep on keeping on together, I think that is the thing that I hope folks can take from it, is we need each other. Like, let's stick together and we can really do it.
Thanks for asking the question, Christine, because I think the thing that we can all do is right in front of us day to day. And I'm thinking about a place like this that, people come together to do whatever feat you're aiming for. Kudos to you and whatever training you're doing right now. And so even just the encouragement and the checking in and, that we're talking about is needed in terms of coaches or with athletes is the thing that we can all do with each other. And so to be able to do that in excess allows folks to feel seen and heard, which then allows them to hopefully be less reactive to other people, and then so on and so forth. So, to me, the takeaway is do the small thing that you can. You don't have to solve this problem. We would totally solve it right now if we could, but we can all do a little bit to hopefully get to an endpoint that, at some point, and I'm so proud that we wrote this in the book, or Katie actually I think said it specifically around, we hope that at some point our book is like, what the heck? That was a problem? This is not a problem. We don't need this anymore. What a silly book. That's the thing we're hoping to get to.
I love that. And thank you both. So we just wanted to open it up if anyone has any questions in the audience. Not everybody at once. Alice?
I actually have 2 questions, but I'll start with the more one that everyone here probably cares about. I'll ask you guys my other question later. Why girls? So this discussion has been very much about youth and coaches and stuff that seems very generalizable to all child athletes. But right on the cover, it's the price she pays. So I was just wondering how you came to that focus.
It's a great question, and I think we've wrestled with that a lot because much of what we were hearing we easily could apply. And I have very competitive nephews in sport, and I would say that most of what we've talked about would apply to their experiences in some way. I think it was important to us to tackle and look specifically at the experiences of women because the experiences of women are often not looked at with the attention that it deserves. It's oftentimes looked at in relationship to men and in concert to what is happening. And it was important to us to be able to look at that more specifically and get a sense of what is happening uniquely in women's sports. Not to say it's not happening in men's sport, but we're really looking at why it matters for us to lift kind of the veil back to have that conversation, knowing how often if we don't physically lift that veil back, the conversation doesn't occur.
Any other questions?
Thank you. Hi, my name's Quiva. I play on a women's rugby team, and something that we talk a lot about is like team culture, and we also talk about the fact that we play at a really high level, but living in New York City, you're kind of like fighting a battle all of the time with just about every variable, and we are in the discussion a lot lately about like how we can foster like that kind of like safe haven mental space, that good team culture, and like how we can kind of push all of these nagging things out of our minds, like resource access and like trying to play really high level but splitting a field with a different level team, these kind of like really challenging things that I do think predominantly do affect like women's and girls' teams. And I'm curious if you had any experiences in writing this story that of positive examples of like team culture, or like good examples of situations where coaches were doing the right thing, and like what were those, and how can we maybe like apply those in our like team or coaching settings?
I mean, I love this question, and it's one of my very favorite topics. Tiffany, I'm guessing you were reading my mind as you were saying this, of more programs need to make exactly what it sounds like your team is doing, which is kind of these early preseason team agreements and being very intentional at creating the culture, because I think that's something that oftentimes gets taken for granted, right? That it's just going to develop itself. And in the book writing process, we had a shocking number of coaches tell us, you're trying to make sports soft. And we're like, tell us more. Like, I want to understand that more. And what ultimately we all know is that if we can do exactly what your team is doing, even if there's frustrations in terms of accessibility of fields or things of that nature, is that if we can be intervening and creating the conversation right from the beginning around what are going to be the team values, what are the agreements, what are the expectations, what is everybody committed to, it actually saves on the back end. And then there can be higher expectations, right? So when these coaches were saying it was going to make it soft, what we know is if we can do things like you're describing, the expectations can actually be higher because there's transparency and there's congruency happening versus everybody just like being in the wild west of what can they expect. So bravo to you and your program. That's a really excellent thing to do. Even if there's frustrations, if you can create team cohesion, that goes a really, really long way.
I think sometimes too, the things that people maybe take for granted or they hear and go, that's not really going to help us, like team agreements or a team meeting or an event that is just getting everybody together to hang out and spend time together. I think when that is a value within the group, and probably not shocking that two therapists would be like, that all sounds really good. But it allows those relationships to grow. And then when those relationships are deepened, then I get to give feedback in a way that says, hey, I didn't like how that thing happened. And it's no longer about nitpickiness. It's about, I value our relationship and I want to have a deeper relationship with you. And so all the things that teams can do to build that culture, and I think there's not a one way to do that. I think there's kind of culture and building the culture as well. Any of those moments develop possibilities to get and maintain that high level.
Any other questions?
Hello, I'm a fresh therapist, and I'm really curious about just like sports psychology and like potentially being a clinician to athletes. Do you have any recommendations for continuing ed in terms of sports, like mental health in sports?
Did you say a fresh therapist?
I'm fresh.
Okay. I wasn't sure. I was making sure it was fresh, not French. And then I thought, like, I didn't know what that meant. And I was like, we have a lot to talk about, I think. Yeah. So one of the things that I don't know if this is going to land with everybody that would hear me say this. Sports psychology oftentimes is misunderstood. There's this belief that if you are a sports psychologist, you're a really good mental health person. And what I tell people is, on the path that you're talking about that you want to be on, is to be a really good mental health person first. Learn how to do all the things, right? Whether that's working in residential, whether that's working in kind of a generalist community agency, whatever it is, hone your practice, and then add in, as you would any kind of specialty area, how to get attached to or focused on what it means to be immersed in sport. The sports teams are hungry for mental health people. And what they oftentimes find is they call the sports psychologists. The sports psychologists come in, not all of them, I don't want to put them all in the same bucket, but pretty large bucket of folks who they're working to get that person back out on the field or back out on the court. I don't think Katie and I would ever say that wouldn't be a goal of ours with the athletes that we work with, but that's not our singular goal. Their well-being is our singular goal. And if they want to get back out on the court or the field, that's obviously part of what we're going to do. So I think, from a continuing ed standpoint, don't turn away from anything that allows you to feel like you're honing in on your skill set, and then keep finding sports teams to spend time with, because you'll easily get hired. It oftentimes is you have to tell them why they need you versus them come to you, because they're going to want a sports psychologist because that's what they've been told to do. And this is the sad part of it, is you're probably going to end up being cheaper than a sports psychologist because we don't get paid very much to do this work as therapists. And so use that as your number one way into that conversation, even if then on the back end you ask them to pay you a lot more. Yeah.
I love that advice. It's so good. I think we have time maybe for one more question if anyone has any other questions. Amazing. Katie, Tiffany, congratulations on your new book. We're so excited that it's out in the world. Everybody should pick up their copy before they leave. Thank you all for being here and being part of this conversation. It really does make a difference.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all.
Before we formally exit, just a huge appreciation to Erin, who, if you ever have a chance or interested in writing a book, get yourself an agent like Susan that tells you you need a writer, and then find someone like Erin, because I just want to say that out loud, given the fact that two therapists are not really set up to write a book. But yet having someone as brilliant and incredible as Erin allowed us to do the work we knew to do, and then to bring it to life through the writing, which is what you're going to read on the page. So thank you.